David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Well, the government shutdown has ended, and we're quickly learning more and more about why Donald Trump has sort of been all over the place on what it would take to end the government shutdown. And it appears that it all along had everything to do with John Kelly and Stephen Miller. And I told you before that Donald Trump at one point said, hey, I would do a clean DACA bill, said it to Dianne Feinstein on national TV, then backed off of that. Then at another point, Donald Trump said, oh, I would sign any bipartisan legislation that lands on my desk to avoid a shutdown. But then he refused to sign a piece of bipartisan legislation that actually did land on his desk. At another point, he said that his U.S.-Mexico wall must be part of the DACA approval, but then that went away. And now there's a great new report from the New York Times that at least partially explains what's going on. It was all along Donald Trump's elegant chief of staff, John Kelly. And by the way, the reason I say that is there's this really weird interview from a couple months back where Trump kept referring to John Kelly as being elegant, and it was just so weird, and we never figured out why. But now I call him the elegant John Kelly.
Not surprising. He is an elegant guy, I would say.
He is. I guess it's not inaccurate. It's just weird that that's what Trump is focused on. So the elegant John Kelly and Trump's outrageous policy advisor, Stephen Miller, have been pushing Trump to just keep going, demanding extreme immigration policy before relenting on the shutdown. Of course, that ultimately didn't happen. The shutdown has been ended. Even Republican Senator Lindsey Graham has pointed to Stephen Miller as just being an obstacle to ending this entire thing, saying, quote, as long as Stephen Miller is in charge of negotiating immigration, we are going nowhere. He's been an outlier for years. It actually might be that Trump is being exploited here by his staff, because it's been clearer and clearer to me that Trump all along did want to end the shutdown and sort of was confused about why they couldn't. Trump's confused about many things, but one of the things he was confused about was why they couldn't end or have avoided the shutdown. But it's his own team that was pushing him to keep it going. And this actually relates to the topic of leaks. Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury, says straight up that part of the reason for the leaks that are just endless coming out of the Trump administration is that the leaks sometimes function as a better way to actually talk to Trump, so to speak, in terms of actually talking to him. If you go to Trump, as Michael Wolff suggests, if you're in Trump's circle, inner circle, staff, whatever, and you try to go to Trump directly and say, hey, here's what we should do, or that's what we should do, it might work, but if someone gets to Trump 2 minutes later and says, do this other thing, then Trump's going to go with that other thing, as we know. If you use the leaks to filter through the media and back to Trump with the optics that Trump often doesn't like around media reporting, it almost might be a better way to get Trump to go along with what it is you want him to do. And that's really a bad thing, because remember, Trump doesn't really have like a hard and fast personal policy philosophy, nor does he really care to. He's focused with optics. He's focused on deal making, period. And other than not Obama, right? We've talked about just doing anything that Obama didn't want or reversing what Obama did. Trump will more or less go with anything if framed correctly and coming from the right person. And what's increasingly both sort of mind-boggling and scary is how much influence Stephen Miller has over Donald Trump, and by proxy, how much influence Stephen Miller has over the national course of politics. We shouldn't understate how much Trump's desperation to just go play golf can also be used. So imagine the scenario that's going on, Pat. You have people in the White House who know one of the best ways to get action from Trump is to leak to the media to trigger reports that Trump won't like and will get him to act erratically, combined with the fact that if Trump hasn't been able to go golfing for a few days, as we saw, he was forced, quote, forced to stay in Washington, D.C. because of the shutdown this past weekend, his desperation to just do anything to get back to golfing will go way, way up.
Yeah.
And this is how the president is deciding, how much do I want to go golfing? and what messages are coming through the media that I want to end as a result of leaks coming out of my own White House.
Yeah, I mean, there's just so much there, and I understand you have to try to influence your boss in some way.
Sure.
But it's troubling that these are the people doing it. I mean, at least John Kelly, he's a Marine.
He's elegant.
He's elegant. He has the gray hairs of experience. But
Right.
Stephen Miller, all he did was work for Michelle Bachmann. He worked for Jeff Sessions. He was Steve Bannon's protege.
Yeah.
And the guy's only 32 years old, and he's essentially running the country.
And I'm glad you mentioned the 32-year-old thing, because that's been mentioned online, and the reaction from some has been, hey, that's really ageist. Like, what's wrong if he says things that make sense or if he has good ideas? Why would you be ageist in that way? I'm not that different. I'm about as old as Stephen Miller. And although it would be lovely to be very much involved in this way at the White House, I have enough sense of myself and self-awareness to know that a 32-year-old just doesn't yet have the experience to be in the position that Stephen Miller is in, which is sort of this de facto policy leader of the United States. He thinks he does, and I'm sure some of the people around Trump think he does. I don't think John Kelly thinks he does, but that's a story for a different day. I would know that I'm way above above my head, I guess is what I'm saying.
I mean,
here.
if you're 32 years old, you can do great things. You can do great things for the country. I think Hope Hicks, who's one of the better ones, she's like 29.
Yeah, it's crazy.
But Stephen Miller's title is Senior Policy Advisor. You'd expect someone a bit older than that.
When you're talking about the top geopolitical and diplomatic decisions that are being made in the world by the United States, you don't usually want a 32-year-old being called the senior anything. That's a red flag, and it's not being ageist. And again, I'm talking about someone who is about my age. Okay, let's talk about that absolutely ludicrous voter integrity commission. If you've forgotten about this, and I understand if you have, I've been trying to put it out of my head as well because it was such a waste of time and money. Immediately after the 2016 election, Donald Trump said that 3 to 5 million illegals voted for Hillary Clinton, and he was going to suss it all out and figure out what happened through something called the Voter Integrity Commission. Kansas lunatic Chris Kobach was put in charge of it. We heard time and again from Sean Spicer and others that this is really a problem, even though we knew that the real point of this was to come up with some anecdotal instances of double voting or a dead person figuring somewhere as having voted to justify further voter suppression. We knew all along that's what it was. The Trump administration, through really the Voter Integrity Commission, which is one with the Trump administration, demanded a ton of voter data from states. Many states refused to do that, and ultimately the entire thing was shut down. DHS supposedly was going to take over the investigation, but we later learned that actually the Voter Integrity Commission destroyed all the records. They weren't going to give any of them to the Department of Homeland Security, and nothing was being taken over. What's the news now? Well, if we needed any more indication that this entire thing was a racially tinged attempt to eventually justify suppressing the mostly Democratic non-white vote, we've now learned that in Texas, the Voter Integrity Commission asked for documents on Texans with, quote, Hispanic last names. We'll talk in a moment about what a Hispanic last name is, but before we get to that, I'll remind you that last year they were asking for 50 million voter records. And in Texas, which has the second largest Hispanic population in the United States, policy advisor Ron Williams checked the box asking for, quote, Hispanic surname flag notation to be included in the files so that they could easily look at the so-called Hispanic voters. Fortunately, this was never provided to the Trump Commission since a lawsuit was filed blocking Texas from sending the data to the commission. Chris Kobach, the totally horrific Kansas Republican who ran this witch hunt, or as they call it, commission, said he didn't know anything about this request for Hispanic voting data, saying, quote, at no time did the commission request any state to flag surnames by ethnicity or race. Well, someone did, and if Kobach is telling the truth, that's actually more disturbing because it suggests that the commission was so dysfunctional that there were people requesting massive voter rolls for Hispanic voters without authorization from the commission and without anybody knowing that it was going on. Independent members requesting voter data with no oversight is absolutely ridiculous. And that proves to me, Pat, that the lawsuits trying to stop the data from being provided were completely warranted since they were completely out of control here.
Yeah, and I'd imagine if 3 to 5 million people did vote illegally and you needed a commission like this, then the discrepancies would be everywhere. You wouldn't have to go to them. You wouldn't have to find these red flags.
You wouldn't have to pick,
artificially.
You wouldn't have to pick the state with the second biggest Hispanic population and ask for the flagging of, quote, Hispanic last names to uncover the irregularities.
It would be everywhere.
It would be everywhere, and it would be abundantly clear. He acted on his own, is what we are being told, and that's actually part of the problem. Does Trump know that there's not only a resident of Texas, but a U.S. senator from Texas with a, quote, Hispanic last name who wasn't even born in the United States? His name is Ted Cruz.
Oh, yeah, his dad killed JFK, right?
Oh, yeah, he's the, what was that hypothesis? He was the Zodiac killer.
Oh, it was like a National Enquirer story, I think.
Something like that.
About, like,
Ted Cruz's
really father being involved in the assassination plot of John F. Kennedy.
Yeah, but I thought there was also more to it, that Ted Cruz himself might have been the Zodiac killer.
Oh, I got to be up on my Trump conspiracy theories.
I know,
I've fallen
there's so
behind.
many I can't even remember them. Okay, the other thing I wanted to mention, what's a Hispanic last name? I mean, I'm aware of Spanish last names, and then there are, of course, European last names that people who have immigrated to Latin America have, like me, for example, right? Like I am from Argentina. I am a, quote, Hispanic immigrant to the United States, according to how those guidelines say I should be categorized. But I don't have a Hispanic last name. And then, of course, you've got all the Germans and French and Italians who went to countries like Argentina and Brazil and Mexico and Cuba and so many others. It's a discriminatory request, but it also shows how stupid they are because they want Hispanic Texan last names. It's all just very weird.
I mean, maybe there are like some indigenous surnames you could find, but they're not the ones that you commonly associate with Hispanic last names. Like it's not Martinez or Dominguez or
But that's
Garcia.
what they wanted, right? That's what you imagine. They want the Serranos and the Gonzalezes flagged in some way because they're like, these are the people that are voting for Hillary and that we need to suss out. So then we can say, look, here's one dude who voted in the wrong place or was double registered, which of course is not illegal or something. This proves that we need even more oppressive voter ID and voter suppression laws. And while we're at it, let's restrict early voting hours, particularly in non-white areas where you might have black people as part of their church-going experience deciding to vote early or whatever the case may be. For now, the good news is the data has been destroyed supposedly, and the Voter Integrity Commission has also been disbanded. Send me your thoughts. I'm on Twitter at dpakman. The show is on Twitter at David Pakman Show.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new member of the day is Tracy Floyd. Tracy, thank you for being a David Pakman Show member. Big thanks to Tracy, to all of the new members that have joined us so far in 2018, and of course to the sustaining members, some of whom have been with us now. We are going to have our first 8-year members in April of this year, because April of 2010 is when the membership program started. And we still have members that joined up back in April of 2010.
I think we should have like a birthday cake on the desk there with
Yes,
candles.
Absolutely. And of course, vegan, soy-free, gluten-free, everything free. It'll be an invisible cake. There won't be anything there. It'll just be a plate. And it'll be absolutely delicious. And everybody will be able to eat it, which is the best thing, no matter what your dietary preferences are. Tracy, thank you, though. You can sign up and join Tracy at davidpakman.com/membership. I crack myself up sometimes.
Yeah.
And Patreon at patreon.com/davidpakmanshow. And actually, this is a good opportunity, I would say, for me to follow up about what's going on with the Critical Thinking miniseries. I've been getting a lot of emails about this, and it relates to Patreon. It relates to, I don't know, it relates to whatever you want it to relate to. We have been developing a mini-series, 12 to 15-part mini-series on critical thinking. And the way that we are sort of funding it or subsidizing it is through our Patreon fundraiser page, which you can find at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And you will notice that we are at 2,006 patrons, and that all you need to do to increase the number of patrons is by clicking that orange Become a Patron button at the top left of the page at patreon.com, top right of the page, thank you, at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. And what you will notice if you look at the bottom left of the page is a goal of 2,100 patrons, which says when we reach 2,100 patrons, we will record, edit, and upload a multi-part critical thinking miniseries, first to patrons and eventually for full distribution. This is something we've been working on for a while now. And the intro to this miniseries is done. Every clip will have a very cool animated intro, the likes of which we've never been able to do so before, to quote George W. Bush. We are going to have a very long list of topics included in this miniseries, including types of arguments, including deductive and abductive arguments, necessary and sufficient conditions, premises for an argument, including implicit premises, the difference between a valid and a sound argument, and an invalid and an unsound argument. We'll talk about logical fallacies, including ad hominem, appeal to the people, the very relevant and popular straw man fallacy, which we deal with a lot. This is going to be really great. And to help get us there, all you need to do, we need only 94 more contributors at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. As of this morning, we are at 2,006, and we want to get to 2,100. And whether you can contribute $1 or $20 or $100 or $1,000, every contribution counts the same. Very egalitarian and democratic.
Yeah, and we're so close to that goal, too. I think we should have one of those CNN-style countdown clocks.
Oh, yeah,
in the
and
bottom
run it
right
for as
corner
long
of
as we
the
need
show.
to. Yeah, sort of like a shutdown countdown.
Yeah.
We will run the patron countdown. That's actually not a bad idea. And when I say whether it's $150 or $100, that it's all the same, please, if you can do the $100, do the $100. But what I mean is all contributions inch us equally closer to 2,100 patrons, and hopefully more information on that soon. Now, I think it would be best, Pat, if we achieved that before February 1st, because what happens on the 1st of every month, some portion of our patrons have credit cards or debit cards on file that have expired during the previous month. And when Patreon goes to run everybody's cards on the 1st, we lose some patrons. So I think that it would be best if we knock this out in January, and then that's it, we're done.
Yeah, the absolute worst case scenario would be that we get to 2,099 patrons on January 31st.
And then we get
February
crushed.
1st comes and we get crushed. Yeah, that'd be bad.
I think if that were the case, I would just call my mom and tell her to make $1 contribution.
Yeah.
You know, just on January 31st,
or my mom.
just to get us there. Or I might call Pat's mom. Yeah, why not? I'll call someone's mom and ask them, or a potential future mom, or even a dad. Why not? I mean, why am I going to discriminate in this way?
2018, after all.
It's 2018, no doubt about it. Patreon.com. What are we even talking about? Patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Okay, interesting little update for you on the Trump-Russia story. And of course, remember that all along we have had a series of moving goalposts, a sliding scale of denials about how there was never any contact with Russians by the Trump administration. Well, maybe there was contact, but there was certainly no coordination. Well, even if we coordinated, it certainly wasn't collusion. And hey, you know what? Even if there was collusion, collusion in and of itself isn't illegal. One of the data points of that coordination was that Trump Tower meeting with Russian lawyer Natalia Veselitskaya. And we were told nothing came of it. We were told that it was a bogus meeting, that there was no follow-up. And then we realized actually there was follow-up. And then we realized actually that was the meeting at which this quid pro quo was intimated, where if the Trump campaign ends up receiving dirt on Hillary from the Russians, and they end up winning, they would be willing, potentially, to ease Russian sanctions. That's what we call a quid pro quo. And now it turns out that not only was there follow-up, and not only was there a quid pro quo intimated to Natalia Veselitskaya, she was in Washington, D.C. for Donald Trump's inauguration and attended an inauguration party 1 year ago. And in fact, the Washington Post has a great piece on the many notable Russians who were very weirdly in D.C. for the inauguration. So many Russians were in D.C. for the inauguration, in fact, that the intelligence community took notice and expressed concern. The FBI was concerned because some of the same people that surfaced when they were investigating possible Trump campaign connections to Russia. Some of those same people were in Washington, D.C. for the inauguration. Wealthy Russian pharmaceutical executive Alexei Repik got close enough to Trump to shake hands with him at a pre-inauguration event. He was seated with his wife right in front of the Capitol building for the swearing in. He took a picture with now CIA Director Mike Pompeo. Viktor Vekselberg is a tycoon who's closely aligned with the Putin government. He was in D.C. for the inauguration. Boris Titov, a politician and business advocate, now running for president of Russia with the blessing of the Kremlin, was there. And Natalia Veselitskaya, the Russian lawyer from the now infamous Trump Tower meeting, was at the inauguration and at an inauguration party. And who invited her? The one congressman who we've heard time and again is a Russian puppet, Republican Dana Rohrabacher. And along with Natalia Veselitskaya, Rinat Akhmetshin was at the same inauguration party with Natalia Veselitskaya. They both happened to have been at that total nothing burger Trump Tower meeting. The random person, Natalia Veselitskaya, who brought nothing to the Trump administration and had nothing to do with anything, happened to be in Washington, D.C. when Donald Trump was being inaugurated, just months after she showed up at Trump Tower to give them dirt on Hillary Clinton in exchange for the possible easing of Russian sanctions. It's just a coincidence, Pat. Why is anybody worried about this stuff?
Well, I think it makes sense. At a presidential inauguration, you not only have like congressmen and senators there, you also have the people who helped you win, right? Your campaign staff. And
Usually
I guess in the audience, you're going to have Russians in this scenario.
That's the most simple explanation, but it's the one that the Trump team is going to be increasingly apoplectic in order to try to deny. So I tried to go back and find, are there any? So we've identified a lot of statements that they claimed were true, which are definitely lies. Maybe when Sean Spicer said at Donald Trump's direction that this was the largest crowd ever for an inauguration, maybe what he should have said is this was the largest crowd of Russians ever to attend a president's inauguration in Washington, D.C. And then that statement made hours after the inauguration would have been true, right? Am I digging a little too deep here for a silver lining?
I'm just thinking that because he said that it was the largest attended inauguration in presidential history, I mean, that means that people were pouring in from all around the world. And not only did you have Russians, you had Ukrainians and people from Belarus and Latvia.
Some of whom I assume are good people.
Yes.
I really hope that Robert Mueller gets to the bottom of all of this, because there are just too many of these so-called coincidences at this point for them to really be coincidences. We talk about how the United States is currently being run by children, and usually it's because of the childish way in which they govern, or the childish way in which they think about geopolitical issues, or the way that they try to appeal to low information Trumpists. It's a very long list of childish type behavior, but now we have something new to add to the list. The Washington Post is reporting that Donald Trump regularly adopts one of those stereotypical fake Indian accents when talking about or quoting Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. This was part of a follow-up report to the now infamous Shithole Countries report, where Donald Trump was referencing Haiti and El Salvador and some African countries. We know that Trump did that. We know that Trump has referred to Senator Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas, referencing her Native American heritage. And this is now a new type of childish, using a fake stereotypical mocking Indian accent when talking about or quoting the Indian prime minister. And I've been careful not to retroactively normalize George W. Bush, because George W. Bush was a depraved and horrible president. But from the point of view of diplomacy and optics, George W. Bush was comparatively like a masterful diplomat compared to Donald Trump. And that's not a praise of George W. Bush. It's just making a comparison. You really don't want to know the accents that other world leaders are using to impersonate Trump. If you think that this is bad, you should see how they see Trump's speech in other countries around the world. I never understood, speaking about Trump here for a second, when people speak one language and they sort of make fun of how people speak English as a second language or as a third language, I don't find it at all offensive to joke about accents, right? It's a really minor thing. It's often in good fun. When it comes to
Right.
Trump, it's just part of his childish nature. But when you only speak one language and there's people who can speak two languages or three and communicate effectively, but with an accent in those other languages, like what is there to make fun of? It just doesn't.
Right.
It's quite impressive actually when people have multiple languages that they can communicate in.
There's no reason to make fun of them because they still made an effort to learn your language and can still communicate with you.
I actually find that when people think to make fun of how someone speaks a language that's their second language, the person doing the poking fun probably only speaks one language because when you speak multiple languages, you understand how difficult it is to make yourself understood sort of in a fluid way in another language. I learned English as a second language. I learned it very young, but my native language is Spanish. And I'm around people who speak with accents all the time. It just doesn't strike me as funny. Like, it wouldn't even occur to me to mock them because, yeah, people learn languages at different ages and you don't always sound like a native speaker.
Yeah, and I understand, it can be done in a comedic setting and it can be done in jest, but it's certainly not professional.
No.
And it's certainly not presidential. And it comes across as offensive in some settings too.
Is it extra funny that Trump's English is terrible and that's the only language he speaks? He speaks at the lowest grade level of any president in the modern era of evaluating the level at which presidents speak. And he's making fun of how other people speak English. There's something weird about that,
like an
right?
English complex, I would say, like one of those complexes.
Yeah, it must have some name. I don't know what it would be, but I'm sure we can assign a name to it. Remind me, Pat, at some point to tell, this reminds me, I don't have time to tell it now, but the how do you say cheese in English story. I don't think I've ever told the story. Maybe on the bonus show. It's a good one. Join us on our subreddit where you can discuss this or any other stories from today's show, davidpakman.com/REDDIT.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
I'd like to welcome to the program today Stephen Payson, who received his doctorate in economics from Columbia University in 1991. He's been a professional economist and adjunct professor for about 32 years. His latest book, which we'll be talking about today, is How Economics Professors Can Stop Failing Us, The Discipline at a Crossroads. This is a very, very interesting topic to me, Stephen, as someone who studied economics at both the undergraduate and graduate level, regularly interviews economists, regularly debates economics with both economists and non-economists. What would you assess as the real crisis of economic professorship that's going on right now?
Sure. Okay. Well, I think, first of all, before I, say what the crisis is, I just want to say that there's a lot of professors who are doing very good work. So I don't want it to seem like, I'm condemning all professors or anything like that.
Certainly.
But, so having said that, I think there is a crisis. It's pretty much a crisis where the profession is too much interested and too engaged and in a way too trapped by its own games that it plays internally for its career promotion and its publications and the kind of work that a lot of academic economists do is really serving a sort of game that doesn't produce much for society.
Give us an example of that. In other words, what's something that economics professors might put time into that you believe doesn't serve society? Is it the publishing of theoretical economics articles, or what is it?
Right. I think a lot of it is a focus too much on theory and too much impressing people, other economists, theoretical economists in the same club. So, for example, I had studied for a couple decades technological change and trying to predict patterns of technological change. And it was a very interdisciplinary approach, which some other economists also take. But in my view, the literature on the effects of technological change have been dominated much more by theory, where the theory just builds up on highly mathematical constructs based on very, very strong assumptions, and it kinds of produces more and more publications without shedding light on what's truly going on in technological change.
So let me tell you one of the concerns I have with the field of economics, at least in most of American colleges and universities. And you tell me, number one, if you agree or disagree that this is an issue, and ideally whether you think it's connected to what you just outlined, which is I am very concerned about the percentage of the time that is spent teaching sort of rational actor traditional economics relative to the amount of time that's spent really exploring the last 20 years of behavioral economics and sort of the way that a lot of these concepts actually manifest in the real world. Do you agree that that's a problem? And is that related to the problem you've identified?
Yes, it is. I agree it's a problem, and I agree that it's related. I think what's happened in economics, and part of it might be attributable to work by Gary Becker and others, has been this kind of option that we don't have to truly understand human behavior if we have an interesting model that we can study, and we can study the mathematical properties of that model and impress each other with what we've discovered in our mathematical models. So it's sort of like understanding human behavior is an option, and there's a substitute for it, which is, more high-powered theory where we just, rediscover essentially our assumptions about it. And it's amazing how this has affected so many things, because it also affects economic policy, because then, if you have an economic problem and we're trying to solve it, and a distinguished professor has a certain theory based primarily on assumptions, but then can say, I published a proof that this is the best solution. It's real. The profession doesn't have a capability to really challenge that. So there isn't a strong enough leadership to say, wait a minute, how much of these assumptions are grounded in reality? If the assumptions are published in an impressive journal, then that sort of like automatically elevates it to acceptance.
Do you believe that sort of classical rational actor economics is still a good basis for students of economics to first sort of understand if humans were totally rational, if we had completely free markets, if the laws of supply and demand applied 100% in the real world, here's sort of how it would work, and then later be introduced to, for example, the teachings of behavioral economics or the limits of capitalism or whatever else. Is that still the right order in your mind, or would you teach economics in a different order?
I think the simple basis of the sort of neoclassical framework could still be taught at the very first level of explaining what supply and demand is, and maximizing utility, and what determines prices and everything else. So I think there's still that basic, element. But then, soon thereafter, we've got to introduce all the caveats and all the other things that determine human behavior, before piling it higher and deeper into our own reality.
I think that maybe, I don't know if you can speak to this, but I think that, so my undergraduate economics degree is from the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I believe that was a unique department insofar as, I had Marxist economist Richard Wolff teaching my introduction to macroeconomics, a 100-level class as a first-year student. And then very quickly, I was able to move into, the late Steve Resnick's class on Marxian economics and other classes that explored sort of the limits of neoclassical economics. Was that relatively unusual as far as economics departments go?
I think so. I think that is very unusual. I'm aware of certain, departments like that, and some still exist, but that is unusual. But we have to also be cautious because I think when we're talking about, I guess what we're saying here is we're talking about pluralism in economics and different, views other than sort of the neoclassical framework. One thing that I talk about in my book is we can get too caught up in those scholarly discussions. And like you could say, well, this kind of helps round out economics so that we understand things better. That's true, but then you could also, create a lot of other distortions because you can have scholars in the room talking about, what did Marx mean when he said this, that, and the other thing, and that wouldn't be very productive for economics today either. So just a general, challenging the simplicity of the neoclassical framework is very good, and basic principles like labor exploitation and those kind of things are good too. But if we get too much into the weeds, into scholarly discussions, then a lot of professors in those subfields tend to have the same problem of trying to impress each other, not necessarily with mathematics, but with their quotations of what scholars had written hundreds of years ago, that kind of thing.
Do you think that, again, anecdotally, when I was at the University of Massachusetts, economics was not part of the business school. It was part of social sciences or humanities, call it what you want. It has since been moved into the business school. And this is something that we're actually seeing around the country, that increasingly economics is being put under the umbrella of learning about business. Is that something that makes sense, or should we be concerned about that?
I would be concerned about that. You have to take these things into context. So if it's a small university, they simply may not have an economics department.
Right.
And they may teach a few economics classes and it would go under the business school. But like when I studied economics at Columbia, it was in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences.
Exactly.
It was separate from the business school. And I think that's right, because I think economics, really should be seen as a science, as a social science, with applications to business, but also applications to public policy, applications to international trade, that kind of thing.
How concerned are you about sort of pop economics, I guess, for lack of a better term, that's leading to just a lot of people believing that they understand economics in a way that they can accurately assess what sort of public and government policies would be beneficial to the economy? Is that having a real impact on government, or is that something that's just sort of going on in media and is not impacting public policy?
I think it's always impacted public policy, and it's gotten worse in some ways because what's happened, and maybe there might be some trends, to improve things recently, but it's hard to say. But what's happened is that models have become so complicated and so dependent on very specific assumptions that you can approach them with alternative sets of assumptions that essentially rediscover those assumptions and make very different conclusions. So, if you want a model that says that if we reduce the tax rate, the economy will grow, you can produce a model like that. If you want a model that says the opposite, you could produce a model like that. And the devil is in the details of the assumptions and the math and that kind of thing, and even the way data are processed and measured and interpreted. So what that has meant for public policy is that there's a lot of distrust, and perhaps rightfully so, in the applications of economic models in general. And so that really limits our ability to use economics, because if we don't trust economics, then we're just basing policies on gut instinct or what we really want to believe. If we don't like taxes, we'll think that taxes are bad. If we want public programs. You think taxes is good to finance the programs. And so it's kind of like economics has become so theoretical that it's created a disbelief in economics. And so a lot of public leaders simply don't believe economics.
We've been speaking with Stephen Payson. The book is How Economics Professors Can Stop Failing Us, the Discipline at a Crossroads. Very interesting topic, and I find it particularly important right now. Stephen, thanks so much for talking to us about this.
Can I just, if you don't mind, I just want to show this because the book is on sale half price.
Oh, sure.
And there's a coupon at this website.
Absolutely fantastic. airleap.org/p.pdf for our radio and podcast audience. Stephen, thank you so much.
Well, thank you, David. Thank you very much.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
I've been talking about this for years, and it's getting closer and closer. It's what I call deathless meat, or as some like to call it, lab-grown meat. There's a company called Memphis Meats, among others actually, and they are about ready to offer lab-grown meat to the masses as soon as 2021, which is just under 3 years from now. Bill Gates and Richard Branson are some of the investors in this company, and they say that they have already produced beef, chicken, and duck directly from animal cells without needing to raise and slaughter actual animals. And the way that it works is by combining cells in tanks and bioreacting it with other elements and nutrients. Memphis Meats is doing this. There's also a company called Beyond Meat. There's another one called Impossible Foods that's working on the same thing. And this would address a lot of the concerns that people have who either don't eat meat or want to reduce meat consumption. If you don't like the killing of animals, it solves that. If you don't like the environmental impact of raising animals and the water and food consumption, it solves that. If you don't like the possible or known health concerns around eating too much meat, it actually addresses that because you can create this meat without animals that are eating antibiotics and possibly breathing or eating contaminated air or grass or grains or whatever. So I guess that would probably make it healthier as well. The main issue has actually been price, which is coming down drastically. The first time I reported on this, I think one burger had a cost of like $300,000. I reported on it again 3 years ago. The cost was down to $10 to $12. That doesn't include, markup and shipping and warehousing and everything else, but that was the reduction that we saw. Would vegan Pat eat lab-grown, deathless meat?
Yeah, I think I would. I mean, I would at least try it. Now, my taste buds have recalibrated at this point, and I don't really crave meat so much.
You're a soy boy now, as the Hatriots like to say.
Oh, I'm such a soy boy at this point. But what I do think is that those who eat a standard American diet, it would be a good way for them to transition into like more of a vegan, vegetarian approach.
No doubt about it. And I've said before, I believe that the consumption of meat from raised and slaughtered animals is going to become more and more niche over time. It's very hard to imagine in 50 years still raising and slaughtering animals for meat the way we do. I mean, it seems totally unlikely, right?
And it's unsustainable, too. We
it's
just don't have
unsustainable.
The land, the water. We don't have the resources.
I'm not sure about eliminated. Like, it might become a very luxury good where, like, in 50 years, if you have actual real animals that have been slaughtered for meat, it would be sort of a novelty in some way. I don't know if it'll go away, but it's going to be reduced drastically. And this, I think, is probably a pretty good path forward.
And hunting will still be around. I mean, if you live off the grid, you have no choice but to go kill your food. But most of us live within the general vicinity of a grocery store and have no need for eating meat at this point.
An interesting question I saw online was, could the process by which this meat is created in a lab be miniaturized so that in the future you could have a home machine and you create your meat on demand right before you cook it or something like that?
Yeah,
I don't know.
Like making your own beer.
Sure.
Or, growing your own vegetables in the backyard, that kind of thing.
Same type of thing.
Yeah.
Now, out of curiosity, would it be okay or ethical or moral or taboo to grow meat for animals you wouldn't normally eat. Like, for example, a lot of people don't eat whale.
Yeah.
Whales are smart, social, whatever, right? A lot of people say, I don't eat whale, even though some countries eat whale. I would never eat whale. Would that apply to lab-grown whale, or would that eliminate all of those problems?
Well, I don't know, because I think people draw the line at a very weird spot. Like, most people say that it's okay to eat cows and chickens and pigs, but it's not okay to eat dogs and cats.
Sure.
I know that you don't eat
well,
pigs,
it
for
depends
example,
in what
right?
country, right? In some
Yeah.
countries it's different. But
Yeah, it depends on the culture, but I just say we shouldn't kill and eat animals altogether. So I don't have that same moral dilemma about eating a whale, you know?
I'm increasingly thinking that there is going to be, we're getting off topic, but a crisis in the vegan community over the fact that we are learning more and more about plants that panic in a way that is reminiscent of sentience, and bivalves that seem to have less, quote, sentience than some plants. I think
Yeah.
that is definitely going to be, not that I'm worried about it, but an upcoming crisis in the vegan community.
First, I would want to see that these plants feel pain. And
Yes.
also, if you want to eliminate or reduce plant suffering,
Right.
you still want to go for that vegan or vegetarian approach, because then you don't have to filter all those plants through animals. Because the animals are eating the plants first, and then people eat the animals.
The animals are eating the plants, and then people eat
Like, to
the
get a
animals.
cow or a chicken or a pig to its size, it's got to eat soy, and it's got to eat alfalfa and all these different plants
Right.
to get it to the size that it is to
Yes.
create that 2,000-pound animal.
Right.
And so
Okay, we'll
So
follow up on this on the
fewer
bonus show.
plants would be eaten.
Yes,
in the
that's
case
true.
that
That's true.
most
And that's
people
the
ate vegetarian or
environmental
vegan.
impact aspect of it. Send me your thoughts on this. Would you eat lab-grown, I don't know,
Meat?
chimpanzee or something like that? What would be the ethics of that? A new poll claims that 0% of Icelanders under age 25 believe in the Bible creation story. And I have many questions about the number 0%, because the poll was taken, number one, by an Icelandic polling company for the Icelandic Ethical Humanist Association, and they've released zero information about the methodology. My instinct is that if the number truly is 0%, it's because a very small number of people were polled. But let's not focus on 0% specifically. Let's just assume it's a very low number of Icelanders under 25 who believe in the Bible creation story. We've also found that there is a major urban-rural split in Iceland on religious belief, which is increasingly something we're noticing around the world. If you are rural, you are way more likely to believe the Bible creation story than if you are urban, which basically in Iceland means you live in Reykjavik, because that's as far as I know, the only real city of any
Well, yeah,
even marginal
Iceland's
size.
such a small country.
I think the entire population of the country is like 300,000 or 400,000 total. Wow. So in any case, big urban-rural split. But what's clear is Iceland is very secular. And other than the problems of trying to avoid inbreeding because the population is so small, and anti-Semitism, which has been a problem for many years for Iceland, they seem to be doing fine with a smaller and smaller amount of religion. The fastest growing religion in Iceland is called Zuism, Z-U-I-S-M, not Z-O-O. And it's an ancient Sumerian religion, and it's kind of considered more or less a protest group. So I question the exact numbers of this poll, but what's very clear is that in the developed world, people are moving away from religion more and more quickly, and that is going to be very interesting over the next 10, 15, 25, and even 50 years, because I don't see anything reversing this trend. And we're going to be in an increasingly religionless world over time.
It's an interesting poll, too, because I wonder about if you talk about like the Bible creation story, if it has to be literally interpreted, or can it just be figuratively interpreted? Like when it says that God created the world in 7 days, does it have to be 7 24-hour days, periods?
I think
Or
it
can
actually,
be
I get what you're
eons?
saying. I don't think that one matters, because my sense is if you don't believe God created the world in 7 days, you probably don't believe that even if each day is 1,000 years, that God created the world in 7,000 years. You probably either believe it or don't, I would guess. But yeah, there's probably
Just as an
some
example,
people who are in between who, depending on how they're interpreting the question, might answer differently. I think there's something to that. But big picture, you also don't literally interpret these poll results as no one under 25 believes Bible creation.
No, it just seems like they didn't find anyone.
Yeah, in this particular poll, they just didn't find anybody. Very interesting. I've only been to the Iceland airport. I've never spent time there, but I would like to go there. I think it would be a super interesting place to go. We've got a voicemail from the Eggman about knishes, interestingly enough, a prime topic for the Eggman. Let's take a listen to what he had to say.
Hey, Dave. when you get a knish at that cool bakery in Boston, are they the round baked ones or the square fried knishes?
Right.
I'm really tired of the round baked ones. I can't even get a square fried knish in Western New York anymore, the kind that the Muslims sell at the street carts in New York City. How come if you buy a knish, a kosher potato food in New York City, it's usually a Muslim guy selling it to you from a street cart? Serious question. Which kind you prefer?
Right.
Not the question about the Muslim selling the kosher food. Shalom, brother.
Yeah, shalom, Pakman. At Michael's Deli, it's not a bakery, but it's a deli. They have the square knish. It's not fried. As far as I know, it is baked, and then you flat top it. If you order it there, of course, then you can take it to go and then toss it back into the oven. I don't recommend using the microwave because it will sort of soften it up.
Yeah.
I prefer an oven, or if you can flat top it, that's really the way to go. But yes, they are the square knishes at Michael's Deli, although Mamala's Delicatessen in Cambridge, Massachusetts does have the round knishes, which I know Pat's very concerned about finding a round knish in the Boston area. And you can do it. You can do it, just so you know.
I don't think I've had a knish before. Thus, I don't have a knish preference.
And on that note of total derailment of the story, we will wrap up the show and speak to you on the phone.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.